Good day to everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Asian Evaluation Week. We are now in our fourth day of our 5-day conference. I hope you're doing well and fine. I'm Mike. I'm with the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. Thank you for your interest to this session. So before I transfer to our moderator, let me just quickly remind our participants on some announcements and house rules. So first, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have questions to our panelists. Also, if you're in social media, please use hashtag AEW2020. You may want to post a screenshot, your key takeaway or learning from this session. And please don't forget to tag us. Now, at the end of the webinar, please do answer a short survey. So this will surely help us in designing future webinar or sessions of this nature. So also a reminder to everyone that we are recording this session and we'll made this recording and also the presentation in the AEW website. I'd also like to promote this e-magazine that we produce. Check out the Asian Evaluation Week, a retrospective which celebrates 5 years of learning, sharing, and connection. So it narrates how AEW was conceived and showcased year-by-year highlights through curated photos and personal stories from the men and women behind the AEW. So I hope you'll take some time to read that magazine, which is available in our website. Moving on to our webinar. So the title for this session, session 25, is Do You Have to Ask? Innovations in Data Collection and Analysis for Impact Evaluation when sample surveys and face-to-face interviews are challenging. Now, our moderator for this session is David Ferranti. I know many of you know David. So David oversees the work of 3IE's Washington, D.C. office, and is also a member of its senior management team. Now, prior to joining 3IE, he was a founder, president, and CEO of Results for Development, and now serves as chair of its board. He also previously part of the World Bank senior management team, and also headed the bank's Latin America and Caribbean program. So David is passionate about evaluation, applied research, evidence-based policymaking, program design, implementation, and assessment. He has been doing this for like over 3 decades, working in over 35 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So David holds a PhD in Princeton, bachelor's at Yale, and he has over 30 publications under his name. So let's all welcome David. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We wish we could be together in person, but we'll do the best with what circumstances have given us and hope to have a very exciting session here. We have a wonderful panel, and our topic, our focus, needs little introduction, I hope, partly because the title speaks for itself, and secondly, because it's been on everyone's minds as we've been living through this pandemic period. We're going to focus on this topic by asking 5 questions of our panelists in the following order. First, why are we seeing this recent surge of interest in remote data collection for IE, for impact evaluation? Is it just COVID? Is it other factors? What's going on here? Second, what are the most exciting recent advances in this space? Third, what key limitations should we keep in mind for what innovations in this space can offer? Fourth, are there ethical concerns that we should focus on? Issues of justice and fairness? And fifth, what does the post-COVID future hold? So we're gonna work through those questions in an informal interview-style conversation. I will ask questions and for each question have some time from each of the panelists and try to make it as conversational as we can. We look forward to questions coming in from the audience, from the participants. We'll get to them at the end, but keep them coming as we go. As Mike said, you should put your questions into the Q&A box and we'll collect them and try to address as many as we can before we finish. And as we are still getting ready here, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I would invite participants to put in where you are, so we get a sense of all around the globe what's bringing us all together and how spread out are we. And I think Mike said you would open up the chat box for people to put that in. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, David. So yeah, so the chat box is been enabled.
Okay. So we'll just get a sense of where we are around the world. Now, our wonderful panelists, brief introductions. They've done so much. We don't want to take up the whole session, but first, Ron Goldblatt. And Ron, if you could just wave a hand so they know who you are. There we are. Is chief scientist at New Light Technologies in Washington, D.C. His background is in remote sensing and geospatial analysis and the development of methodologies and tools for monitoring natural hazards, land cover, land use changes, economic development. He's currently leading a bunch of projects with the World Bank and probably others, monitoring economic activity with nighttime lights, tracking urbanization processes in developing cities, remotely sensed impact evaluations, and using advanced geospatial methods for disaster response and management. And he is also looking into the impacts of COVID-19 on local economies, making the data accessible and understandable. So in Ron, we have a real card-carrying, knowledgeable person about the technologies here. Our second panelist, Doug Glandon. Doug, if you wave a hand, is a senior evaluation specialist at 3IE. And his background is in public health, health systems research, policy and practice, with a focus on mixed methods, theory-driven evaluation in low and middle income countries, and the linkage of monitoring, evaluation, and research evidence to government policy. He works across sectors, providing technical guidance and quality assistance to impact evaluation, systematic reviews, evidence gap maps, replication studies, and he leads 3IE's initiative to expand the application of remote sensing, geospatial analysis, and big data into impact evaluations. So he brings another perspective, complementary perspective to this discussion. Our next panelist, Maria Ruth Jones, thanks, Maria, is a survey specialist in the Impact Evaluation Unit, known as DIME, at the World Bank, where she coordinates DIME analytics, an initiative to increase and standardize data quality across the DIME portfolio. And she works on agricultural impact evaluations. She created and runs DIME's annual Managed Successful Impact Evaluations course. She's, along with her other work, currently focusing on integrating non-survey data sources to inform about COVID-19 policies. So another complementary perspective. And our fourth panelist, Bilal Siddiqi. Bilal is the Director of Research at the Center for Effective Global Action, CIGA, at the University of California in Berkeley, where he articulates and advances CIGA's intellectual agenda. His research interests lie in political economy and applied microeconomics, focusing on the relationship between law, institutions, conflict, development. And his current work includes addressing the need to track the impact of COVID-19 by using cell phone and satellite data. So there's our panel. And I'm going to now suggest we jump right in so we don't lose a minute. And our first question is, as I indicated at the start, the first topic, why the recent surge of interest in remote data collection for IE, for impact evaluation? And is this addressing a longstanding need? Is it a COVID stopgap? Is it is this interest just reflect the hype of new technologies? So let's start with Ron. And Ron, from your perspective on all of these issues, why the accelerated interest? What's behind it? And is the emerging work in this space addressing the long-term needs or just the stopgap response? And where is it headed? Ron, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the discussion around various types of alternative measurement techniques and technologies that do not require in-person presence or interaction for both policymaking and impact evaluation. I think that nowadays, most efforts are put towards understanding the impacts of lockdowns and other policies on short-term economic activity, social patterns, connectivity and mobility patterns, which allow us to reduce our reliance on governmental and official economic data, which typically are not generated in such a high frequency. So remote sensing measurements, whether nighttime lights or air quality, can tell us a compelling story, and I would argue a relatively accurate one, about the impacts of social distancing policies and other quarantine measures. And you can see some examples in the next slide, slide 6. For example, we at New Light Technologies are involved in multiple projects with the World Bank that aim to measure and report the impacts of COVID on local economies and make this data accessible and understandable for decision makers and policymakers. Now, obviously, the COVID pandemic is changing every aspect in our world, and we all know that, including the way we measure phenomena on Earth. With the emergence and improvements of technologies, there will undoubtedly be an increase in the interest to utilize novel measurement methods that align with the recent restrictions.
Thanks, Ron. Maria, over to you. What do you think about all this? You're on mute, Maria.
Great. Thanks for including me on the panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I think that COVID-19 has catalyzed interest in what has been an existing trend over the last at least few years towards innovations in data collection. If we can skip to the next slide, please. You'll see a small chart here on the right that shows data use at DIME, which is the Impact Evaluation Department of the World Bank. And you can see that over the years, we've had an increase in uses of say satellite and survey data, for example, and some decrease in the reliance on survey data. I think that's just one example of this change over time, but certainly the recent pandemic has increased a lot of focus on these non-survey data sources. And these these innovative data sources are safe, and that's really important at this particular point in time, but I think they're much more interesting for impact evaluation for other reasons as well. They're lower cost, they increase the scale and frequency of data that's available, enrich the possible outcome space, so they change what we can measure. And of course, they allow us to access data where it wouldn't be possible to kind of put boots on the ground, as we often say. So I think that this is a trend that's going to continue to be really important in the sphere of impact evaluation. We'll see more and more types of data getting integrated into impact evaluations, and that will be particularly important in areas where in-person data collection is not possible, but even as we move into a new normal, I think these will continue to play an important role. And I think they'll just also add that the innovations in data collection, I think, apply as much to surveys as to including new data sources. And we've done a lot of work as well at DIME in thinking about how to transition some of the in-person data collection efforts to things like phone surveys and SMS surveys, more remote data collection that still involves some in-person interviews. So looking forward to thinking through that as well.
Thank you, Maria. Bilal, let's go to you. What are your thoughts on the types of needs these new data collection approaches are addressing?
Thanks so much, David, and thank you for having me on the panel as well. So I am just sort of blown away by the kinds of research that has come up since the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll just speak to and the extent as Ron and Maria pointed out, to which new data sources and new technologies are being used both to understand the pandemic and to address it. I'll give some additional examples from SIGA researchers who for example, work from Saul Chang and Marshall Burke to actually understand the environmental impact. You must have seen this in the news back in April when there was cessation of economic activity, the extent to which pollution had actually reduced and what its actual life-saving impacts were on the health of women and children. This is all based on data from space, like Ron's. Ted Miguel and others are doing work in 9 different countries using phone surveys to understand the impact of COVID-19 on sort of long-term panels that are running across these countries, households that are facing the economic and other impacts on intimate partner violence and others. So there's a lot of work that can be done with these phone surveys, with these new network data collection to understand the impacts. I just wanted to flag one very practical need and application of these data sources to addressing one serious problem right now, which is really the challenge of targeting. At a time like this, when governments are looking to find those with the greatest need, particularly those affected severely by COVID-19, a lot of new poor and vulnerable that are falling into poverty as a result of lockdowns and health disruptions and other things, many countries lack any recent or reliable data on people's living conditions because typically these social protection programs are constructed around large censuses and then the social protection is assigned based on poverty means testing or other measures of poverty. What do you do now that there are all of these new people who are affected by this massive economic crisis that is coming as a basis of COVID-19? In the next slide, I can show you a couple of methods that are actively being used now and that we're trying to catalyze both research and interest in implementation on. So if we could move to the next slide, the first application is satellite-based targeting. So if you look at these 3 figures, what you're essentially seeing is up on the top left, a household survey, and what a household survey can give you is information about individual households. Typically, what one does is collapse that information to larger administrative regions. So if you look down, you'll see these states and local government authority level descriptions. But when you apply machine learning and artificial intelligence based methods to actually identify in the same way as Ron is suggesting, Ron kind of showed, we can get micro estimates of poverty with the kind of sort of precise sense of economic activity or poverty that you can see in the picture on the right. And that actually tells you and can tell you at a high frequency what regions, what micro regions, in fact, are actually being most affected by something like COVID-19. Could we go to the next slide, please? A second source of data is mobile phone data. So call detail records and the patterns of phone use can actually help identify individuals who are suffering poverty by the numbers of calls they make, the number of international calls, the frequency with which they fill their credit. And again, all of this data can be anonymously entered into these algorithms that can predict essentially how much, how poor or how much you are in economic distress. If we could see the next slide, you can see, and this is work joint with Maria and Josh Blumenstock, who's leading this effort at SIGA, that this work in using cell phones and satellite data can directly compete and be equally successful as survey data in targeting the ultra poor. And they did this work in Afghanistan over the last several years and find these amazing results that you can find with precisely these same individuals. Now, if you take this application, and could we move to the next slide? If you take the same application and take it to one country, so this is an example of Togo. Again, on the left, you see standard household survey-based targeting. The colored areas, the greens and the whites, give you a sense of where the poor people are using survey data. But on the right, using satellite-based targeting and phone-based targeting, you can see the much more precise micro estimates of where people are. And the best thing about, in fact, these targeting approaches is that with the onset or the sort of advent of electronic-based cash payment systems, you can actually transfer cash directly to individual phone subscribers or households in regions where you see these negative effects. And finally, in one more slide, I'll show you how this work can be directly useful to policymakers, because as Maria pointed out, these data can be collected frequently and cheaply. And so you can take all of these data and build them into a dashboard. This is a dashboard for Nigeria, where you can take different data sources. On the left, you'll see there's consumption estimates from satellite data, from survey data, and reporting of COVID cases. You can take all of these data, overlay them, and allow policymakers to have a real-time estimate of the particular conditions of very specific areas. This is quite zoomed out, but you could actively zoom in very precisely into particular local government authorities that are both facing poverty and high outbreaks, and target them specifically for this kind of social protection. So I think this data is basically the foundation of, could form the foundation of a very concerted evidence and data-based approach towards targeting populations in need and helping with COVID relief and recovery.
Great, thank you, Bilal. And just before we go to our last panelist on this question, who will be Doug, we are now at 74 participants, I see. And to keep your questions coming in, use the Q&A box. We'll collect them and address as many as we possibly can before the end of the session. And Mike or one of your colleagues, can I come back to you in 5 or 10 minutes to hear what you found about where people on this call are coming from, what parts of the world they're in now. So give you a chance to see what you found. But now back to the matter at hand. Doug, you've heard from your 3 panelist colleagues. What do you make of it all?
Thanks, David. So you were asking about whether the response is addressing long-term needs, or it's a kind of a reaction to COVID, or if there's hype involved. And I think the other panelists have convincingly pointed out how it's a combination of long-term needs and a COVID response. So I agree with that. I also want to add that I think there's a little bit of hype involved in this. But just with respect to COVID, I think certainly the need for gathering data when you can't go in person is very clear. It's also urgent in this case, and as Bilal was mentioning, in terms of targeting the response for the pandemic. You know, I think these kinds of needs prompt a lot of creativity and innovation in these data collection methods, which is actually quite useful, as tragic as the situation is. And so there's a combination of, you know, keeping track of what's happening now, plus the predictive modeling to try to anticipate what will happen with the pandemic. We've actually seen lots of competing models for that. And so I think we should at the same time also make a distinction between the use of these methods for descriptive and predictive purposes like targeting relief, and their use for impact evaluation. So making causal attributions so that we can identify which interventions actually worked or didn't work. So we can use that information for subsequent needs, whether it be a pandemic response or otherwise. So, you know, thinking specifically about impact evaluations, there's a lot of excitement in the field about how remote data collection, and especially big data, can benefit impact evaluations. So, for instance, making it easier to conduct evaluations in difficult contexts, whether that be conflict-affected areas, humanitarian emergencies, pandemics. Also benefits related to strengthening the research design, increasing the scale, speed, and affordability of impact evaluations. So there's lots of excitement. But the actual application of these methods and impact evaluations for global development is still quite limited, and that's what I'm sort of displaying on this slide. A systematic assessment of the literature completed a few months ago by colleagues at 3IE and Flowminder found that there were just 48 impact evaluations using big data sources between 2005 and 2019. So in the slide, that's the darker blue at the bottom, the small bars. So that represents roughly 1% of all the impact evaluations in global development that were conducted in that time, which is still relatively recent. In contrast, you can take a look at the lighter blue bars in the slide. There were 381 measurement studies using these methods. So how do we gather information about needs or a certain variable? And that's it, that's the focus of the study. Quite a bit more of that. So that may be an indication of what's to come. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So going back to the hype question. So if we consider the hype cycle curve created by the research firm Gartner to represent the maturity of different technologies, it seems we may be rising quickly toward this sort of peak, this peak of inflated expectations. So we're hearing about exciting applications, but we don't yet know much about the failures. So these high expectations can then give way to this sort of next part, this trough of disillusionment, as we learn more about the shortcomings and those become surfaced. So, hopefully,
such a great chart.
Hopefully the drop in this case won't be too steep. And hopefully conversations like these, more conversations like these, actually will help us progress along this curve more rapidly, if this in fact is a representation of what's to come.
Great, thanks, Doug. And the panel on this first question. I hope the questions are coming in. I'm going to float one myself in the hopes that we can get to it. And that is that the prospects for these new techniques must vary a lot depending upon the sectors or themes or questions that one is looking at. It's one thing to obtain data from a satellite on soil moisture or forest cover or something or other. And it's quite another if you are a health worker worrying about malnutrition. And so be interesting if the panelists have time later to reflect a little bit on some of those challenges, but we need to move on. And panelists, we're running a little behind, so I'm going to ask you to be even crisper. Our second question, again, returning to the frame and outline we set at the beginning, is what are the most exciting advances in this space? And Doug, I'm going to, since you just talked about big data systematic mapping exercise, I'm going to start with you this time. And from your perspective, what are the most exciting recent advances, and in what specific ways do they help us evaluate impact better?
Thanks, David. Next slide, please. So thinking specifically about big data sources, there are three main types of big data. Human sourced, so social media, crowdsourcing, citizen reporting, process mediated, so administrative data, call detail records, digital transactions, basically events that are systematically logged as they happen. And the third type is machine generated data. So from satellites, sensors, drones, it could be aerial images, and so forth. So of these types, it seems that the steepest recent growth has been in machine generated data, so satellite data especially. For example, in this big data systematic map that I was talking about, satellite data was used in over 80% of the impact evaluations. and over 70% of the measurement studies, whereas the other big data sources were used much less frequently. As for the benefits, there are actually quite a few, so I'll just focus on two, and thinking about satellite data specifically in this case. So one is measuring new variables, or measuring variables more accurately. So to give a very simple example, let's say you're interested in measuring crop yields remotely. You can use existing data on crop yields in many different agricultural plots, and then compare them with satellite images of those same crops to help calibrate satellite-based estimates. So the on-the-ground data is used to train, so to speak, machine learning algorithms so they can estimate crop yields elsewhere. And a similar type of approach can be used for a variety of other variables, like calibrating nightlight data to estimate poverty or economic development, or using satellite imagery to estimate population distribution, infrastructure quality, and other variables. And I should note that these variables can be used either as outcome measures, or they could also be covariates that can help the researchers better account for various factors that might bias the results. A second big benefit is in constructing a counterfactual, this question about what would have happened to this same group of people if they had not received the intervention. And because satellites are always on, so to speak, across geographic areas and over time, you can estimate the variables of interest in the same way for your intervention group and for a comparison group before, during, and after an intervention. And the breadth of the satellite coverage also helps you identify which types of groups in different geographic areas might be the best comparison. And so this is a major benefit of satellite data that is, incidentally not present for the other sources of big data, which can actually substantially be biased based on the people who are generating the data. But I will stop there.
Great, thanks, Doug. And Ron, you work a lot with satellite data. Is Doug's characterization of the rapid recent growth right? Is he on the right track? And if so, what might be the main drivers of that growth?
So yes, it is, and I totally agree with Doug. And I think that there are multiple new advancements in this field. So first of all, free and open sources of data are becoming increasingly available across space and time, and they allow us to capture every location on Earth, sometimes on a daily basis in high or even in very high resolution, spatial resolution. And much of this data is owned by governmental agencies, whether it's NOAA, NASA, European Space Agency, and others who make this data free. So more and more satellites are being launched. They are smaller, less expensive, and with increased capabilities. And because some of the data is available since the 1970s, this allows us to go back in time and understand long-term processes over decades. If you can go to the next slide, slide 21, there is also an increase in the availability of parallel cloud computer power, which today is much more affordable, and it is much easier to access this data via different web data hubs. Some of them allow running the analysis on the cloud without downloading the data, so Google Earth Engine, for example. And in parallel, new open source algorithms are developed for large scale yet robust analysis, including for impact evaluation. So these advances have many advantages for impact evaluations. One, they allow to measure and proxy more types of outcomes, such as economic growth, GDP, poverty, or wealth, as Doug mentioned. Two, they allow us to measure every location on Earth, including over inaccessible locations. And three, they allow us a continuous measurement before, during, and after the program. And finally, and not less important, their increased availability also decreases the cost of measurements associated with impact evaluations.
Great. Maria, your views.
Great. I agree with Ron's final point there, which is about the decreased marginal costs and the kind of exciting opportunities that presents for more real-time information available to policymakers. And I think that's really important from an impact evaluation perspective. At least at DIME, what we do is work with governments on policy impact evaluations, right? Trying to understand what are the effects of different policies, different decisions, different programs. And so having information available at a really high frequency changes the relevance and makes it potentially a lot more relevant. So to give one concrete example that's related in this to COVID-19 response and analysis, we're colleagues at DIME are involved in a World Bank task force on mobility data analytics and understanding how we can use call detail records, so records, administrative data from mobile phones essentially, to understand mobility, look at population movements and responses to things like lockdowns, identify potential disease hotspots and model disease spread. And now the really high frequency of this data, it comes, we can know, essentially at the time of any call is made, right? So there's very, very high frequency and high coverage of the data. It allows us to look more directly at impacts and look at particular discontinuities from a policy announcement. So you can see in the chart that I've included on this slide, for example, that there was, in response to the lockdown that was announced at the end of March, there was first a really sharp spike in an increase in movement before the lockdown became effective, and then a large drop off that then sort of petered off over time as people sort of started to move around again anyway. And so having that data available at high frequency can help policymakers to understand, what impacts do particular policies have, and then to look at when there might need to be a new policy response. And this is a case where we've worked with the government of Zimbabwe to put together a dashboard that provides all of this information in a digestible and user-friendly way, similar to what Bilal was saying with the example in Nigeria. I think it's important, both the analytics, but also the presentation, and having this be a way that's understandable and interactive and answers policy questions is what will make it actually actionable and impactful as we try to integrate more evidence into decision making.
Thanks, Maria. And Bilal, have we missed anything on this topic? Anything else you'd add?
Yeah, just super quickly, I don't think anything's been missed, but I've just really kind of stated what everyone's been saying, which is, about 80+% of the cost of impact evaluations has always been data collection. We used to joke that essentially we take all of this money and use it to hire Jeeps and fuel and buy fuel and to rent Jeeps, buy fuel and hire people to go around the country. That's it. And it's silly that is the bulk of the cost of data collection, of impact evaluations. In contrast, these kinds of data are cheap and getting cheaper by the day. They can be collected automatically. And I think this really points to a fantastic opportunity for 3IE, the Asian Development Bank's evaluation group, and all the other sort of partners in this space to build a consensus and best practices on how to make such data more accessible, both to researchers as well as to governments, depending on how these data are collected, so that they can actually use these data. Because that, to me, still remains the biggest constraint, is being able to access whether it's CDR data or administrative data or any of these other things, or even just costly satellite data.
Thanks, Bilal. That's a great question to end this segment on, and perhaps to return to, because we've all known and experienced the problem that data collectors come in, take the data and disappear, and the populations concerned don't really get the respect they deserve of hearing what the results are and being the owners of the data on themselves. And now is that compounded in an even more difficult way. Mike, I just want to check in with you in case you have anything on where around the world all our participants are from.
Yes, David. Actually, I was disconnected and I have to go back. So we have here participants coming from Indonesia, Haiti, Ecuador, Mexico, Japan, Australia, Philippines, and US. So we have a good representation here. So
that's great. I think 84 overall, and in Europe it's the like 3 o'clock in the morning or something.
yeah.
There. So we'll give them a pass this time, but we'll be tougher next time. So let's go on. We've been to the first two of our questions. namely why the recent surge in interest, and second, what about these exciting recent advances? Now let's talk about the limitations. What are the limitations and some of the concerns that we ought to keep in mind as this development unfolds? And so, Bilal, let's start with you this time. What are your thoughts on the limitations, especially any that are not so obvious or may not be receiving enough attention so far?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much, how non-obvious this is, but I think it constantly needs to be emphasized. I like to say that artificial intelligence cannot, at least yet, protect us from natural stupidity, which unfortunately is what goes into designing artificial intelligence. The simple fact that we all humans are both creating the data, writing the algorithms, and making the decisions about what does and does not happen with the data that we have access to. So keeping in mind natural stupidity, it's well known that for example, artificial intelligence algorithms have to, or machine learning approaches such as the ones that have been discussed, have to rely on existing data. And if that data is biased, it's poorly measured, you can't really expect the algorithm to do anything but amplify those biases. Similarly, cell phone data of the kind that I was describing in this targeting application, we know that cell phones are less likely to be held by women, less likely to be held by the extreme poor, and could lead to errors of exclusion, where the very people you're trying to target don't have access to the technology or don't turn up in the data sets that you're using. So just, I guess, to emphasize that these do not neatly replace existing systems and ideally work hand in hand with them, and that they should not be applied blindly. And again, a lot of folks are working on trying to regulate and understand the pitfalls of these systems. Those concerns need to be taken very, very seriously. And yeah, I'll end there.
Great, thanks. And Maria, your thoughts?
Thanks. I agree with Bilal that there are potential limitations and biases, most of which come from ourselves, right? Come from our understanding of this data and our ability to interpret and use it. So one important point I wanted to mention, which again is quite closely related, is this question of bias in coverage. So that could come from, say, ownership of mobile phones, as Bilal pointed out, or it could come from other things related to how the data is generated. And it's really important to think critically about where data is coming from and what that might mean for how complete and accurate it is. We've done, I think, across the field of development, over the last decades, there's been a lot of research into the accuracy of survey data, how to improve measurement, how to think about it. And I expect similar work, is still forthcoming on a lot of these newer data sources. So just to give one example of what I mean by potential bias in coverage, comes from a project that colleagues in Time are working on in Nairobi, which is an impact evaluation, again, with the government of Kenya, that's looking at how to reduce how to improve road safety by particularly by reducing traffic accidents. And so, the first important question to answer there is just, where are these traffic accidents actually happening? And that turns out to be not a straightforward question to answer. So colleagues there worked with the National Police to digitize and geolocate all of the crash records, and as well worked with data from Twitter, developing an algorithm to scrape reports of accidents and crashes from Twitter and geolocate those as well. Now, when you compare the two sources of data, it gives you a very different picture, right, of where are the traffic accidents taking place, even what time of day are they taking place. And so that can actually tell us a lot about, the accuracy or the, kind of lack of coverage in any of these particular data sets. So the police data is much more likely to involve fatalities, for example. Those are when the police will be called. Where data from Twitter is much more likely to represent accidents in areas that are less served by the police. So this is just an example to say many of these types of data have biases that we don't yet fully understand, and that there needs to be a lot of work done in interpreting those and exploring those as this goes forward. And that, I think, brings me to what I would say is a really critical limitation. An important point to keep in mind is that I don't think big data sources will replace survey data any time in even the medium term. That survey data will continue to be a really important tool for ground truthing and verifying the accuracy of big data analytics that are taking place, and it's going to be, as well complementary for a long time. So while I think there's great potential that we've been talking about big data, I don't think it will become the go-to for impact evaluation in the near future.
Thanks, Maria. Doug, what limitations from your perspective should we be focusing on?
I think Bilal and Maria both raised some great points, like bias in artificial intelligence and big data sources, the need for ground truthing. Regarding bias, actually, Maria's slide made me think about, there was an article I was reading about a smartphone application in which people were reporting potholes in the city of somewhere, maybe Boston or something like that. And there was this, map that showed all of these problems related to potholes were in certain parts of the city, when in fact, it didn't actually represent the quality of the roads. It represented the people who had the app and were reporting, which was not the area of greatest need. And that's, the very same thing that can happen with smartphones if you have crowdsourcing for people to identify needs in, let's say, humanitarian emergency or something like that. So it also is a situation where these may seem like obvious examples, like, oh yeah, of course, that's going to be biased. But in the moment and in an emergency response, it's not as obvious and harder to think about. It might become clearer in retrospect. So it does require a lot of thinking, because it is quite possible that jumping to these sources could result in situations that are sending resources in ways that would be worse than not using these methods. So we just have to be thoughtful about when that might happen. I would say, in addition to the issues of ground truthing, there are other major potential data quality and transparency issues. I mean, the field is still at an early stage, and the dramatically greater volume of data and the complexity of processing and of analytical methods actually makes it much harder to share data and methods notes that are clear enough to enable other people to replicate the findings or even consider whether they think what you did is valid. One example, since we're talking about COVID, is the recently retracted studies in the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine on the use of hydroxychloroquine for treating COVID-19. Those studies were based on a large database developed using machine learning with electronic medical records from 671 hospitals in 6 continents. And there were substantial transparency problems, and the data ultimately couldn't be validated and the articles were retracted. And it also created a big pause in the research that was being done to try to address COVID and identify therapies that are working. So, perhaps not surprisingly, very few studies in the big data systematic map reported on data quality issues. It's like just 6%. And even fewer provided data and code publicly or upon request. That was just 4%. So one last thing I want to mention is that also remotely collected data doesn't really tell us that much about the implementation context or beneficiary experiences or the how and the why of observed changes for many types of interventions. So I think to complement what Maria was saying about the ongoing need for survey data, or the fact it's not going to go away in the medium term, similarly, mixed methods continue to be important in this respect.
So Ron, your take on this question.
So yeah, we talked a lot about how satellite data can offer a new way to better understand social and physical processes on Earth. But there are some very important challenges that we need to consider, and basically not all technologies fit all purposes. And this is what illustrated in this slide. So for example, for various impact evaluations applications, the resolution of free and open source remotely sensed imagery will simply not be useful. Think, for example, about counting the number of trees or detecting specific types of crop fields or even counting the number of buildings or structures in a given village. And this is something important to remember, there are many things that satellite data simply cannot measure. So for example, employee productivity, people satisfaction, or their well-being. Other challenges are more technical, but also crucial, for example, atmospheric conditions, cloud coverage, or sensor limitations that could limit the amount, the quality of the information that is being derived from the satellite image. Another important point is related to machine learning and AI, which are an integral part of remote sensing. It is often a challenge to design a robust enough algorithm that could be generalized across space and time and not apply for a specific limited area. And one last challenge that I want to mention is the causality issue. So establishing causal relations between random variables for any data, including from satellite image, is perhaps the most important challenges in today's science. And revealing the correct direction of causation is not trivial, and in many cases under-considered, or at least does not get enough attention in the remote sensing domain.
Great, thanks, Ron. Now, just before we go on to the fourth of our 5 questions, I know we're running a little bit behind, but I think the conversation is interesting. We'll try and catch up. I'd like to, to help us catch up, I'd like to ask the panelists as we're going now to be looking at the questions that are coming in. And Mike and his colleagues have been assembling them in the chat box. And when we come to question time, I will turn to the panelists and you pick the questions that you'd like to respond to, and for the sake of the audience, mention the question that you're responding to. And for all other participants, please keep the questions coming. There's some fascinating questions in there that I think will make for very good exchange going forward. Our 4th question, coming back to our scheme, is the ethical concerns. And what do we need to think about here that we may not have given enough attention to thus far? And Ron, let's start with you this time.
So yeah, if we can go to the next slide, please. Obviously, privacy concerns are always raised when talking about satellite data. And this indeed might be the case when dealing with super high resolution imagery. However, I should say that much of the work that I'm at least doing is with medium resolution imagery up to 10-meter resolution, where it is almost impossible to detect very fine details. There are also some data privacy issues. As I mentioned earlier, analysis of so much data is increasingly done on the cloud, where we also need to store external sources of data and make sure that they are protected and only accessed by the right people. There is also another term that I like using, humanizing pixels. And you know, sometimes in remote sensing scientists, and I should admit that sometimes I also find myself in this situation, are disconnected to some extent from what is actually happening on the ground, and that there are actually people behind the colors of the pixels. Sometimes the mere colors of the pixels simply do not capture the actual experience or reality on the ground. And finally, much of the remote sensing analysis, including for impact evaluation, is done with computers and fancy or less fancy algorithms. And this brings us to some important ethical issues of AI. And I think that Bilal mentioned it, including AI biases. And you know, after all these algorithms that we are using are developed by humans. And it is not rare that discrimination is either consciously or unconsciously built into these algorithms. Another question that is often raised when dealing with AI is whether we should or can we allow machines to guide policymaking and actually lives. This is also relevant to automatic remote sensing based impact evaluation.
Great, thanks, Ron. Maria, from your perspective? You're on mute.
To me, the most important challenge that the global research community in this case needs to confront is the lack of any type of ethical governance structure for big data projects. So with surveys, most of those are considered human subjects research, since it involves face-to-face interaction with people who are participating in these research studies. And so most of those are governed by institutional review boards and have specific emphasis specific approval processes in place with regards to following ethical guidance. And there is no such approval process in place for big data studies, since they're mostly deemed not to be directly human subjects research, since the interactions are not face-to-face. However, these big data sources often give you data that's personally identifiable or can be re-identified. For example, the very high resolution microsatellite data, in the more like 1 meter range, also mobile phone records, some administrative data, and most importantly, even data that might not seem to be identifiable at an individual level on its own, when it's integrated with lots of other data sources, which is an important step in making this data really maximally useful, it also dramatically increases the likelihood with which one could then identify any particular individual there involved. So that's, I think, important that we need to think about and address. That might be addressing it through better norms and protocols for, de-identifying or integrating these data sources. But I think most importantly is coming up with ex-ante strategies for determining what is approved, kind of ethically approved research.
Thanks, Maria. Doug.
Going back to the big data systematic map that I was referring to earlier, I mentioned that few of the studies talked about data limitations, and very few talked about ethical issues, though the ones that were raised included informed consent, data privacy, data security, those kinds of issues that we've just been talking about. But there are other aspects that did not come up that are also important. There are multiple parts or aspects of development research, impact evaluation that are more difficult to do remotely. We talked a little bit before about the difficulty of having qualitative information about the context in which an intervention is taking place. And that's partly a data quality issue that informs your inference, but it also is an ethical issue because it can result in you making conclusions or recommendations that actually are misleading. And also the opportunity to engage beneficiaries in shaping or informing an impact evaluation in some way, or possibly even the questions or data collection approaches of an impact evaluation. That's not really possible, or it's harder. It's much harder with remote data collection. It also may be more difficult to have meaningful and ongoing engagement with policymakers, implementers, beneficiaries, other stakeholders, in order to make sure that the impact evaluation question is actually responsive to local policy questions. So possible to do, more and more people are connected, and there are good examples of that being done well, but I think an inherent challenge. And relatedly, we're seeing a relatively large number of impact evaluations that are conducted from afar. This is not a new thing in global development, but the increased interest in conducting fully remote impact evaluations without any in-person data collection at all could exacerbate this dynamic. So in the systematic map of the 48 impact evaluations, 83% of them were conducted in low and middle income countries. However, the majority of the authors, 80%, were from the global north, and of those 61% from the United States. Less than half of the authors had a collaboration with a global south researcher, and only about 30% of the studies included some sort of a north-south collaboration. So I think that's an issue for us to also keep in mind.
Thanks, Doug. And if we come to you on this point, Bilal, let's pick up on that last point Doug was making about impact evaluations from afar, since this has been a topic that I think SIGA has put some focus on. What do you think about this? To what extent are these new ways of collecting data accessible to LMIC researchers, and what are their concerns about exacerbating inequalities in impact evaluation research?
Yeah, no, this is a super important point. And I think, in fact, Irene Garganta from, I believe, the Philippines has also raised this as a question about how data requires technology connectivity and access. And this, there's also big differences in who has access to the data, how literate are the populations and able to use it. So I think this is fundamentally a problem. As somebody sitting at Berkeley who was not trained in data science, I find myself behind the curve, and I'm constantly looking to data scientists to answer questions that I cannot. And I find, and there's a huge population thanks to 3IE, like the evaluation groups at the various international banks and obviously academia, that has really mainstreamed impact evaluation using traditional methods. And there's a big worry that now there's a whole new jump, and that requires different kinds of training and processing power and data infrastructure. I would only say that this is, again, this is essential to keep in mind. What's really fortunate is that there are all of these fantastic sort of research institutions across the global south that are developing their own schools of data science. So BRAC University just launched 2 months ago the School of Data and Science. SIGA has a partnership with BRAC, and one of the things we've been wanting to do is they build up their capacity of their data science researchers in partnership with folks at Berkeley, but fundamentally kind of empower them to do collaborative research and even independent research on their own to use the sources of data they have access to. Makerere University just recently launched a group on artificial intelligence and data science research. I could go on. I think the main thing to keep in mind here is twofold. It goes back to broadly the ethics question as well. One, what are the researchers' incentives? And what are the two, what are the incentives of government that are usually involved in gatekeeping and also consuming these data? From the researchers' incentives point of view, ideally, researchers see this as an opportunity to get both access to data, but also more fundamentally, as Doug was pointing out, healthy collaborations, because ultimately both the access to data as well as the ultimate consumers of these insights are sitting in country. And so again, this is a really important moment for the people who are the institutions that are in the space, that have power, that have funding, that have the ability to set the norms, to actually incentivize researchers in particular to make sure that they have these kinds of collaborations. I'm looking at you, Doug and David, to lead the charge on this in particular. Thanks.
Thanks, Bilal. And we now come to the fifth and final question, which is, what does the post-COVID future hold? And we're challenged on time, so I'm going to need to ask the panelists to use half the time to say exactly what you were going to say before, be more telegraphic, and I'll start waving my arms or something rather if you should get even more telegraphic, so that we can then go on the next session with where we address the questions. A nice bunch of questions have come in from the now, I think 90 it was participants. And I'll turn to the panel and you pick the questions from the list and then speak to them. So let's start with Doug on this question of what does the post-COVID future hold? Half the time and everything you want to say.
I think we probably all agree that demand for remote data collection is likely to continue to be high and possibly increase after COVID, in part because of the increasing accessibility of the data, progress in development and understanding of methods for gathering and processing and using the data, and also the continued pressure to reduce the cost and time of impact evaluations. In terms of, what should this post-COVID future look like? I completely agree with what Maria said earlier. Big data sources, for instance, remote data collection should be a complement, not a replacement to conventional forms of data collection. And we also should be really thoughtful about the specific areas in which the topics and the research questions that are most relevant. This goes back to a question you were asking David earlier about where is this most useful? Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also as the number of impact evaluations increases, we're likely to see increased scrutiny of these methods, more and more conversations like some of the ones we're raising now, greater recognition of these limitations, technical limitations, ethical limitations, questioning of power dynamics, voice, and legitimacy questions in terms of impact evaluations conducted from afar. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Doug. Maria, and then Ron. Maria?
All right, two final thoughts. So first, if you can skip to the next slide. So I wanted to emphasize the point that Doug made earlier about the need to apply these clear high standards for ethics, transparency, and reproducibility to all research studies. I think there's been big improvements to, or big gains in reproducibility, transparency, and credibility, you know, within development, development research, development economics over the last years. I think applying those consistently and thinking about how to apply those to studies that rely more completely on big data, making sure that that data is published, making sure that algorithms are transparent, that methods are clear, that there is a large enough community of data scientists that are scrutinizing these and really bringing public attention, and the improvements in quality that we've seen to more traditional forms of analysis of microdata, I think is critical to making sure that these innovative data sources are really used to their best capacity and to further truth. And then finally, again, can we skip to the next slide? I wanted to highlight some of the public resources that are produced by our team, which are listed. I guess it's the next one still. All right, anyway, that's fine. So I wanted to highlight some of the public resources produced by our team, which I think we have here in the slide deck, but if not, we can perhaps share later. Anyway, but they can easily be found by Google. Our important premise within DIME is, again, this commitment to transparency and to making all of the resources that we produce public for this purpose of providing education to colleagues. So Ron, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do it short. So, we've talked a lot about the benefits of these new data collection methods, but as Doug mentioned earlier, the actual use of big data sources for impact evaluations, including satellite data, is still fairly limited. So I think it is crucial to keep promoting and educating on the use of these tools, especially geospatial data and remote sensing. So we at New Light Technologies, together with 3IE and SIGA and the World Bank, have established the Geo4Dev initiative. If we could go to the next slides, yeah. With the aim to leverage cutting-edge data, training, and technologies to advance the frontiers development of development's economics for impact, for policy impact. We are planning to launch this initiative in the next 2 or 3 months, starting with a series of courses on the use of nighttime lights for development measurements and impact evaluation. So I hope to see many of the people attending this panel an integral part of the initiative. So please contact us using this email address that you see here on the screen for more information about this important initiative.
Great, thanks, Ron. And Maria, we'll make sure that missing slide is in the pack that goes to everyone. Sorry about that. Bilal, any final comments?
I think the missing slide is just a little ways down, but thank you for that opportunity to tease my slide, which is the next one. And that's just to announce super quickly, SIGA is launching an initiative, I think next week, around exactly the same, the application of big data to responding to the humanitarian crisis brought about by COVID-19. And specifically, it is to support innovations in targeting. They don't have to be of the kind that I gave an example of, but fundamentally, the question is, for current social protection programs, of which 190 countries have scaled up in the last 6 months. If you are part of a government agency or an NGO that is implementing social protection programs, or a research team that is working in the space and or has links in the space of policy, we are just opening up this expression of interest is open right now, and RFP will be released soon. Please go to siga.berkeley.edu/initiative/targeting and register your interest. Even if you don't need money, we really want to know who you are so we can try and coordinate this response and make these innovations in data as useful as possible at this time of urgent global need. So thanks so much again for the opportunity to speak on the panel. And I'm excited to hear the questions and respond more fully.
Great, thanks, Bilal. Now, let's take up the questions that have been rolling in. And Doug, I'm going to put you on the spot by starting with you. If you can pick some of the questions and mention the question and your thoughts on it.
Sure. First, I will address your earlier question about, you were asking about which areas are most useful or relevant to this. I think, because I talked a lot about satellite data and big data, I'll focus on that. Naturally, for satellite data, it's going to be the types of things that you can see from above. And most of the studies, not surprisingly, are those that are focusing on environmental sustainability, like deforestation, looking at economic development, the various methods like Ron mentioned, using night light to estimate economic development or use as a proxy for economic development. Sustainable agriculture, food security, some related to health. You can sort of understand climate conditions based on geographic, topographical features, vegetation, ground cover, that kind of thing. Water and sanitation. So those would be the types of areas where you're going to see more from satellite data, and certainly you'll see less. It will be much more difficult for satellite data if your intervention is, say, inside a facility. You're randomizing, patients to different treatments, or you're doing a, workplace productivity intervention, within, a building. You're not going to see anything there. Or if you have interventions in which eligibility is based on some sort of, let's say, needs-based threshold, you're not going to really see that, from above in a discernible geographic pattern. So I'll just stop there for that question. As to some of the other questions, one, is it possible to estimate individual outcomes with machine-generated data? Yes, it is. You can, there are two different ways you could go about this. One is if you're using, let's say, big data for prediction, you can become very precise in terms of predicting outcomes or inferring outcomes based on the training of the algorithm that you've done with your known ground truth data. And that can become, right into an individual's household. Similarly, for big data sets, like I gave the example earlier of electronic medical records and the machine learning that was used to estimate outcomes for COVID-19 therapy using hydroxychloroquine. That's another example where it gets down to the individual level. So it's possible. It would be difficult in situations where some of the critical information you need is not available at that level of granularity. And you have to combine multiple different sources. And then, of course, as we talked about, there are challenges sometimes with assessing the quality of that data or validating it. So let me pause and hand it over to other panelists to address some of the other questions. And if there's time, I can come back.
Great. Who would like to go next?
So maybe I can.
Okay, Ron.
So there was a question about source. Can you suggest a good source well to find quality satellite data? So remember, we talked about fit for purpose technology. So it depends on the question that you want to answer. If you want to measure changes in economic activity, economic development, maybe you will want to use nighttime light data. There are many sources of free satellite nighttime light imagery owned by governments and made publicly available by NASA, NOAA, and others. Data imagery. So also this data, the publicly available data is made available to the public by government agencies, NASA, NOAA, the European Space Agency. I would also recommend, I'm a big fan of Google Earth Engine. Google Earth Engine is a platform owned by Google. So they store all these free and publicly available data sets and make them publicly available. And also they provide the algorithms for the analysis. So most of the publicly available data sets you will be able to find in Google Earth Engine. There's another question about data requires technology, connectivity, access, which poses a great impact on poor countries in terms of reliability of data. I totally agree, and I think that this is the advantage of using publicly available satellite data that capture every location on Earth, every country, including the poorest countries. I think that combining this data with tools and capacity building is the way to answer all these questions. So I agree that there's a challenge with technology. I still think that satellite imagery, because publicly available and free satellite imagery capture every location on Earth, this allows us to answer many more questions that we were unable to answer before.
Thanks. And Maria or Bilal, one of the, Maria, okay?
Sure. Great. Let me answer first part of question one that I don't think was Doug had a chance to get to, which is about the question about how to address ethical issues that might arise in accessing individual data. So one, I think that's a great question, and there isn't a definitive answer to that. It's going to depend on the data context. But I think one way in which we have addressed it, for example, with the mobility analysis that we're doing for COVID-19 response, is to actually work with aggregated data. So to receive from the mobile network operators data that's already aggregated up to a ward level, which is an administrative level. So rather than receiving the individual data, we receive aggregates that still provide us granular enough data to be able to look at movement and some of the key indicators that we want to, but we don't receive that highly sensitive, individually identifiable data. So that's, I think that's something to be thought about even at the process of data acquisition. And again, I think something that would be really important to be addressed in kind of an ethics approval process, just to think about, you know, what level of identifiability or what level of granularity is really necessary to answer the question at hand, because there's always trade-offs between precision and privacy. So keeping those in mind ahead of time is important. And then let me also address, I think, question 2, which is whether big data can be used for causality and attribution. And I would say certainly yes, but I think our experience at DIME has been that that we've had a lot of success, or a lot of really interesting results coming out of working with integrated data systems. So thinking within a country context, answering a question by integrating a lot of different data sources. Those could include household survey data or firm surveys, administrative data from the line ministries we're partnering with, but also say sensor data, satellite data, any kind of other big data sources. So thinking about all of those as a whole and creating kind of a data ecosystem within which to work has been an important way for us to kind of apply some of the more, you know, I guess I would say traditional methods of impact evaluation in terms of developing a sample, having a clear counterfactual, but then bringing a whole breadth of data that goes beyond that initial framework. And I will just the very last one I'll address is part of question 4 about whether there are technology-driven measures to mitigate biases in these new data sources. And I think, again, that the point that I was just making about integrating different data sources is a really important one there to thinking about mitigating bias, because in order to mitigate bias, you have to understand what that bias is, right? And think about what direction the bias takes and how that is going to affect your results. And oftentimes that's not known. And so being able to quantify and add some directionality to that bias by comparing data with other data sources is an important first step in thinking about how to effectively mitigate it. So I'll turn it over to Bilal with that.
Bilal, the last word.
Thank you so much. So I think most of the questions have been answered, but I'd maybe dwell on a few. I think I answered Irene's questions a little bit in my response about involving LMIC researchers in particular to make sure that the bias on the producer of research and doesn't kind of persist. But there's a related issue also on data privacy, which I think Irene has also raised. That is essential also because in many of the countries in the global south, these the data privacy regulations are poor, the enforcement is poor, ownership of this data is extremely dubious. And I think my response would be very similar, which is, right now we're in the unfortunate, I guess, position of having to trust cell phone companies with cell phone data, governments with administrative data, and so on and so forth. These are not fundamentally, in many countries, the agencies or the agents that we would like to have control over these data. Adding researchers to the mix probably isn't great, but I think there are plenty of initiatives, including at the World Bank, which I'm more familiar with, that are trying to make sure there are at least data privacy regulations in place. The problem ultimately is somebody's got that data. What they do with it is a little bit up to them. And does one feel more comfortable, or at least somewhat comfortable, with trying to engage with the question of using that data ideally for a social good? I don't know the answer. I totally acknowledge that there's a problem, and I hope there's a way forward. A couple of, again, related points. Do we use these data to analyze unintended effects or only the intended ones? I think from the researcher point of view, it's finding out the unintended effects is often more interesting and more relevant and important than finding the intended ones, and informing policymakers of these differences of the different types of effects is super important as well. And so I don't think there's that kind of bias from the researcher's point of view. What again the policymaker takes on board is somewhat up to them. There's a question on the effort, time, and cost that it takes to collect and process and clean this data. And that is absolutely true. It is very hard to not only clean individual data sets, but somehow make them interoperable. One of the really exciting sort of new sources of data, which I encourage you to check out, is called SHRUG, which I've now forgotten what it stands for, but Spatial High Resolution something. It's basically combining massive amounts of spatial and census and survey data from India, which is not a small country, and is available for free download. It's been created by former colleagues of ours, Sam Asher and Paul Novosad at Dartmouth. They've kind of made this data interoperable and available to the world, and that kind of work really needs to be done more broadly. And finally, I think there's kind of related very much to this is this question of transparency and replicability. That's a whole other element. I think 3IE and many others, in Berkeley, the Berkeley Institute for Transparency in the Social Sciences, which collaborates closely with DIME at the World Bank as well. We're focusing a lot on this. That's a whole other conversation, but changing the norms of transparency, around transparency, and accessibility and reproducibility has been, I think, a heavy slog. Fortunately, a lot of these norms are slowly changing. Researchers are moving to GitHub, open access repositories of data. The World Bank itself has a microdata catalog that in principle, every project and research endeavor is eventually kind of lodged there. 3IE has its own repositories. But that is again, the plea over here would be that agencies and institutions that have power in this space, notably those who fund this research, those who curate this research, and those who consume this research, should really be pushing for greater accessibility and transparency there. So again, I don't have an answer, but I really do sympathize with the statement of the problem.
Great, thanks, Bilal. Let's recap what we said and heard in this discussion. Fairly briefly, I'm going to try and do that and get us done at the hour. And so I won't cover everything, but I hope some of these thoughts will stimulate further thinking by everyone who's participated here. The first question we focused on is why is there this recent surge of interest? It seems obvious, but there are different points of view, and all three of the hypotheses are probably at work, namely driven by COVID-19, also by long-term needs to do things better and differently. And also there is some hype about new technologies. And some of on the COVID-19, some of that interest has been fueled by the need to gather data remotely because of safety, but also urgency to gather data rapidly in order to target pandemic response and adapt in general to this new world that we're in. We also heard that with regard to the long-term needs, there's interest in reducing costs, expanding the scope and scale of data collection, addressing challenges related to management bias and precision, and including increasing the variety of variables that we can analyze. And on the hype, we're still at an undetermined spot on the Gartner curve, but we'll see how things turn out. There's certainly a high level of excitement right now. The second question was about what are some of the exciting recent advances. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat all of that, but we heard about some of the advances relating to big data sources, especially satellite data, some of the opportunities, some of the slides shows what could be done. So there's a big opening area up there. Then we went on and we talked about the limitations that need, in some cases, more attention. There's a bias, potential for bias of inclusion and exclusion, challenges of data quality and transparency, and an ongoing need for ground truthing to assess data validity. And many of these limitations have been only minimally addressed in the published impact evaluations to date. So there's work to do there. We also talked about the inherent difficulty of gathering information on implementation context and beneficiary experience, and addressing questions of how and why an intervention works or not. How to do this in those things in this new world is still a long journey. We talked about ethical concerns. That was the fourth question, and many were raised. Some about informed consent, data privacy, security, the potential to systematically exclude certain populations, a lack of adequate ethical review processes. And there were some issues that are not getting as much attention as they should and will need to. The whole issue of collecting data from afar and what that means without interacting with the local stakeholders and beneficiaries, without understanding the context, and in effect taking people's data and information without them knowing about it or hearing much about it. Issues that have been around before, but maybe especially important in this new world. And then we close with the fifth question, what to expect going forward. And there's a consensus, I think I heard in the panel, that the increased use of remote data collection methods is here to stay. and even after the pandemic subsides, because there are engines of change that are driving in that direction that extend well beyond the pandemic, the need to decrease time and cost of impact evaluations broadly. The panelists also agreed that the remote data collection, I think I heard, should be thought of as a complement to more conventional data and not a replacement. We'll need both. And going forward, there's also a need to continue to equip researchers, especially researchers in the global South, and with the skills and tools they will need to make effective use of in this new world. We heard about some specific initiatives, and the information on that will be available in the follow-up deck on Geo4Dev, on SIGA's work, and on DIME. So we're at the hour. I would like to thank the panelists for an enlightening discussion and congratulate the panelists. You had one of the lowest dropout rates I think I've ever seen in one of these webinars. Essentially, the numbers kept growing and pretty much stayed at what they were. So congratulations for that. And thank you to all of the participants for joining. And I know how frustrating it is. It certainly is frustrating for me as a moderator and our panelists not to be able to interact more directly, to hear you, to hear your views. And we hope to get back to a world where we can do that. But thank you for your time and for your wonderful questions. There are ways to follow up. All of us can be found. We cannot hide in the internet world, so you can find us with your questions. And finally, to the Asian Evidence Week team for organizing it and making this easy and coordinating it so well. And I think you had your intro material, the housekeeping, is a model for others to follow. Before you all go, don't forget that there is a pop-up survey that will come onto your screen when you log out. It's quick, it's short, and since we're all here about making better data available for better decision-making, please help the Asian Development Bank and the team working on Asian Evidence Week to get your data to make these events good in future. So thank you very much. 2 minutes over, apologies for that. I owe you 2 minutes, but it could have been worse, let's say that. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.